Hello and welcome to the second episode of our Peripheral Vision reflections on Moses. Last week, the reflections primarily revolved around the book of Genesis and the peculiar character that the book of Genesis holds. Because as I was trying to say last week, it's more of a prologue that sets up the story of Moses than a book in and of itself. The question is not so much where is the universe and where does it come from, but what is the nature of the problem that God is trying to solve also through Moses, but even beyond. And the statement is that it goes so deep that it goes to the fundamental roots of creation. And so it is a very, very deep problem, this question of slavery and how one is liberated from that kind of captivity. And as we heard from last week, the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, prefigured and prefaced by the stories of Adam and Noah, leads God's people into captivity in Egypt. And this then led me to the interesting problem of Egypt itself and of the historical veracity of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And very oftentimes, we are led into the questions, and scholars are always asking, whether or not, in fact, the stories are historically verifiable. And I don't think that that is an appropriate question to ask. Not because it's just, good or bad to be questioning the books of the Bible, but actually more accurately is if you want to do any amount of history at all well about Egypt and Israel, maybe about 1500 years before the birth of Christ, you are going to be invariably in a swampy mess of an impossible period to truly figure out. And this is why I wanted to emphasize a mystery as opposed to an absolute certainty. Because we know Egypt exists. We know that the Jewish people exist. We know that the Jewish people in Israel existed. And yet, at the exact same time, to be able to want absolute certainty for such a long period ago is next to impossible. And a warning of Sherlock Holmes, whom we will be referring to periodically throughout these particular reflections, will be of particular importance here. He says, "I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit facts." And he says on a different occasion in another story, but equally importantly, "Data, data, data," he cried impatiently. "I can't make bricks without clay." Basically saying, don't pretend you have more information than you actually have. And when it comes to Egypt, and it comes to Israel in Egypt, we don't have a lot of data except for the Pentateuch itself. Now you might say, well, we would need some corroborating evidence in Egypt to be able to verify Israel's claims. Well, herein lies a problem. Something that we've been discovering about ancient Egypt, because it is a very old civilization, roughly 3,500 years old, is that when something bad happens, or a king or a ruler, or Pharaoh or a ruler comes up that they do not like, there is a thing called damnatio memoriae, which means that, let's just pretend like that never happened. And so there are certain examples of pharaohs and pharaohesses in Egyptian history that were disliked by the other political authorities or the religious authorities of their day, that says, after Akhenaten has died, Akhenaten IV, we didn't quite, Akhenaten was the extra name that he took on for himself. But Amenhotep IV, that's the guy. Amenhotep IV, that Akhenaten guy? Let's just wipe him out of the memory. But here's the problem. He still existed. Even if they tried to get rid of his memory, they wiped him away from all sorts of different memorials. They tried to desecrate his tomb, but there was still the Amarna period of archaeology. We found it. And it turns out this guy existed. And he was a guy that wanted to change Egypt upside down. He wanted to make all of Egypt worship only one true God, and they didn't like him very much for it. So they tried to wipe out his memory. So if that's the case, then it's entirely likely that if you have a story of Egypt being ransacked by the god of their slaves, you probably imagine that they'd wipe that for the memory. However, that doesn't make it true either. At a certain point in all times in history, you have to kind of go, this is maybe true, or this is maybe real, but that is why I don't think it's an appropriate question. We have the text as it is, and it is a monument just as much as the Sphinx or the pyramids or any of the other great burial mounds of Egypt. And one of the reasons why I take a tremendous amount of stock in the Pentateuch, in these first 5 books of Moses, is that not even that necessarily Moses wrote them, but that they come from him. And it's precisely because they are so weird, and yet so profound in their wisdom, that I give them a lot more credit than I do most any other texts. And the first and most obvious sign that I am willing to take it at its word is that it does not suffer from the exact same kind of propagandizing that you see in the ancient world. What you'll often get is, oh, great glorious king, blah, 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 blah. When you read the story of Moses, it is refreshingly honest. I don't get the impression of propaganda. It gives all of the nuances, subtleties, and shades of a real man going through a real journey, that even if the miracles and the signs happen, the miracles and the signs are a secondary account. The test is, does it understand the human heart? Does it understand how people function? And yeah. And not only does it add flavor and character to Moses and the Hebrew people as a whole, but the story of Exodus actually makes God is a believable character. That you see that even God's infinite power gives him certain limitations and allows God, in a sense, to have a depth of character, motivations, passions. But not passions in the sense of passivity, but desires. God has a desire for his people. And that his desires for his people can be conflicted. And that Moses brings those conflicted desires out by his own conflicted desires. And not the least of which, usually propaganda starts by saying how great and awesome we are. But at the central story of Israel is that they were a slave people who had lost themselves, lost their identity due to captivity, and that God not only liberated them from captivity, gave them an identity, and that they resisted God setting them free. It doesn't make it true de facto, but I believe it more than I believe anything else. And so the second book of Moses, commonly called the book of Exodus, is the beginning of a brand new type of story. It begins with the trials and the sufferings of the Hebrew people. That after Joseph died and his descendants then made themselves a home in Egypt, the book describes it thus. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war befall us, they join our enemies and fight against us, and escape from the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. And in all their work they made them serve with rigor. So you see part of the problem. They are in Egypt, and it's precisely the blessing that God gave to Abraham that said that you will be the father of many, many children, precisely becomes inverted and is the cause of their suffering. Because as their numbers increase, as the blessings increase, then that draws the attention of Pharaoh. Which is why, oftentimes, in the lives of the saints, one of their great advantages is anonymity. They seek to hide, precisely because power always looks for grandeur. And that if we seek to grow ourselves, this will inevitably attract the kind of attention that we may not necessarily want. And what's very important in the story then is you see that Pharaoh, the tyrant, is afraid of their increasing numbers. Not simply that they're increasing, but that also that they could join their enemies. And so Pharaoh dealing shrewdly with them is a smart but cowardly act. It is a preemptive strike, if you will, where he realizes that if there is a possible danger, rather than submit himself to providence and say, well, who knows what could happen, but I refuse to do evil. This is where power and prominence becomes its own shackle. And what you will see, and what we will continue to see throughout this initial narrative, is that Pharaoh is himself constricted by the blessings that the world has given him and God has given him. Because Egypt is a fantastic civilization. Let us not deny the obvious. But it is built on agriculture. The Nile is the center of some of the most fertile farming that the ancient world had ever seen. But then that prosperity then also creates a vacuum that sucks in the outside world. Because if they can produce food, then they have power. But there's always downsides. The more food you have, the more people want your attention, and that you have enemies that want you to fall. There's also problems of healthy diet, struggle, danger. So Egypt is being constrained by itself, and because it's constrained, it is willing to constrain others. This is part of the function of living in the world. And so in an attempt to maintain control, Pharaoh then willingly and knowingly dominates. And this is throughout the centuries, and it is not exclusive to ancient Egypt, a tactic or a strategy of tyrants is to overwork and burden people so that they forget their heart and soul. And it is also an effect of trauma. Trauma can also be, in a sense, a kind of Pharaoh. Because if we are so burdened with our past, we are so burdened with our sorrows, we are so burdened by our shame and our guilt, that it's hard for us to think of freedom. And so in an attempt to control the population, to control his problem, Egypt orders the midwives that at any Hebrew child that is to be born, if it is born a girl, then they'll allow it to stay, but all the Hebrew boys will die. And again, a definite sign of the growing tyranny of any civilization is when they start looking at children as a threat. It is a sign that the society has started to look so inward and to be so protective of itself that it actually cannibalizes itself. And this is not something that is simply seen in Hebrew history, but you can see it especially also in the false gods of the ancient world. The most interesting and compelling and well-told stories come from ancient Greece, of 3 generations of gods consuming their own children. And so Pharaoh, true to form, wants the children to be killed. And the midwives shrewdly disobey. What they do is they let the children live, and when Pharaoh says, "What are you up to?" they say, "These Hebrew women are really robust. They just seem to be giving birth before we get a chance to give them a hand." This then only makes Pharaoh more worried, because if the Hebrew women are so strong and they're giving birth so prolific, then he only then increases the tyranny. And this is a forerunning of the problem of sin in general. The danger of suffering then leads us to sin. And then the sin that we commit then increases the suffering. And then in an attempt to mitigate the suffering, we increase the sin in a vicious spiral. And as always, it is the poor that suffer. And so Moses' mother, after Moses is born, in this particular period of danger, knows that she can't expose her child to the truth. She can't expose her child to what is going on in the world around her. So she hides Moses after his birth. But when she can hide him no more, she puts him in a little basket and leads him down the river. Because she knows that if her child stays with her, he will definitely die. But if she lets him go, there's a chance that he might live. And that small outside chance and the willingness to be open to it is one of those open doors that God will always use throughout the history of his people. When if there is only a 5% or a 2% chance of success in a particular hand of life, we will play that hand if that is the only just hand that we can play. And so the child is left into the hands of providence. And Moses' mother expresses the kind of courage that the powerful Pharaoh is too weak to live. And interestingly, letting her little boy out and away, he's found by Pharaoh's daughter, who's come to the river to bathe. And she sees the child and has compassion for him and says, "I'll raise this child as my own." And she knows it's one of the Hebrew children. And so herself recognizing the drama and the heartache of whatever mother must have done this. And so an empathy occurs among the family of the oppressors. She then summons for a Hebrew woman to say, "Take care of this child." And that woman knows exactly who it should be. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river, and her maidens walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and lo, the babe was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother, And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, for she said, "I drew him out of the water." The text is so rich that all you would need to do is to read this story and know the whole meaning of Moses' story. And yet there's so much more, which is quite simply, put your trust in God. And not only will you, yes, you may have to give him something that is your deepest heart's desire, but God will usually give it back to you and better. Those who love their life will lose it. But those who discount their life for the sake of God will find it. And so Pharaoh then adopts Moses into his household through his daughter. And this then puts Moses as a figure between two worlds. His mom obviously raises him aware of his Hebrew background, and yet he will be adopted by the highest echelons in Egyptian society. So he is now a man who knows the insides of both worlds. And this would mean that he'd also then be very familiar with the gods and the worship of Egypt, and also the hidden tradition of the Hebrew people. And this dual situation makes Moses a very unique figure, because he would have a certain sympathy for both worlds. And so one day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man who did the wrong, "Why did you strike your fellow?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. This will be a very important moment in Moses' life. Because you see, you can see the influence of his mother and of his family and his sympathy for the Hebrew people. An Egyptian is brutally beating one of them in the standard procedure of slavery in Egypt. Malnutrition, beatings, all sorts of horrible practices. And you can see that Pharaoh, even by adopting this young man as his own son, hasn't got quite the Hebrew out of him. And so he has a sympathy for the oppressed. But that sympathy does not help. That something deeper has to be occasioned. And you can see that Moses is still kind of conflicted, because he hides the body and has to do that whole looking left and right thing, which shows that he's not entirely sure of what it is that he's going to be doing. He kind of knows that not only is it wrong, but it's a short-sighted solution. And this is one of those things that we will notice about the unfolding of God's revelation through Moses, is that God's plan for his people is not simply to be moral, but to be able to live truly fruitfully, not just today, but in the long run. And that you can't simply, for instance, just wield power and authority. There is, to a degree, too much which it has to be earned. And that's why the inevitable subsequent story is then when Moses then notices, hey, it's not just the Egyptians oppressing us, but it's also us oppressing ourselves. And he wants to stop it. But by what authority does he do so? And that is the precise rebuke. You were a murderer of them. What are you going to do? Murder me now? And violence, like many short-term solutions, in the long run just doesn't work. And it has the effect of alienating, isolating, and minimizing the possibilities of success. So Moses flees and goes into the land of Midian. And it's while he's in Midian that Moses encounters some women who are trying to feed their flocks and are being harassed. And so he protects them and helps them feed the flock. And in gratitude for his defense of the women, their father, Pharaoh, says, how would you marry one of my daughters? It's one of the first inclinations of a general rule that will inform much of the scriptures, which is righteousness does have its rewards. If you're generally trustworthy, just, and good, then you are often rewarded. And Moses is given a great life in Midian. And this is part of the interesting character of his story. He has a wife that he loves. He's got a home. And it's a simple life, a good one. And at its root, something that every good person would want to be able to have. To be able to go home at night and to be able to say, this is my family, I am good to them, and they are good to me. But then there are dangers to that. Because in Egypt, the whole tyranny of Egypt is built upon the premise of a peaceful household. In order for me to have my peaceful household and for me to have my agricultural system, then I need servants to help me organize my farms. And then the more farms I get, then the more organizing I need. Then the more organizing I need, the more tyranny I need, and it becomes a vicious circle. And so while Moses is able to figure a very simple and straightforward game in his world in Midian, the very nature of life itself almost begs the question of tyranny. And it gets to the point where the tyranny becomes unescapable. In the course of those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned under their bondage and cried out for help. And their cry under bondage came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the people of Israel, and God knew their condition. For God to know their condition is a profound statement of connection. It is nuptial in its character. That God, knowing the condition of his people, is that of love and of compassion. And sometimes you can only step in when the problem is so deep that there's no hope for resolution, except by some divine intervention. But a mere act of power won't truly save the day. And so, prepared inside God's plan for liberating his people is the long-term plan to truly set them free from what enslaves them. That they need to be somehow invited into the real meaning of freedom, lest they simply fall back into bondage. And so, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and lo, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, Do not come near. Put off your shoes from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you, that when you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. There are many things that deserve to be brought out in this story. First, is that you see a symbol of God's power in the burning bush itself. Because what we have is a bush that is burned, and yet the bush is not consumed by the burning. This is a symbol simultaneously of God's power and of God's gentleness. God's burning is one that burns off that which is untrue, but retains in us and perfects in us that which is true. And that is why coming close to the true and the living God is, in fact, a dangerous thing, that you do not simply approach the living one, because insofar as there is something untrue in us, it is burned off. And so that gentleness of God is to say, stay there. You can't come any closer. And that is why Moses instinctively also covers himself. And the Lord God, seeing the sufferings of his people and knowing their trials, is what then turns God's heart to bring them out into a new land. But first, the promise is not simply to bring them to a promised land. The first process by which they get there is to worship on this mountain, Mount Horeb, that will also be known as Sinai. There's often several names for the same character in the Old Testament. They can have many dimensions to them, and so many names are a reflection of their many dimensions. But sometimes it also takes wisdom and insight to be able to see how these many dimensions work. You'll notice that Moses notices the burning bush, notices that it is an anomaly in his experience, turns to it, and then when the Lord God sees that Moses wanted to look, that the invitation begins. And this is why God summoning Israel to worship on this mountain will be the necessary prerequisite for the freedom that he wants to give them. Because unless one wants to go towards God in worship, not simply also in worship because of praise, but to be able to recognize how different who God is to all other things in the universe, and that he is worthy of our attention, and that not only is he worthy of our attention, his very nature demands our glory and our worship. That Moses then is revealing what his mission will be. His mission will be to be the one that is able to turn Israel's and our gaze to the one true God, away from all the false gods, that by worshiping them, by attending to them, we only increase the cycle of slavery. And so that the whole purpose of Israel's freedom is ordered towards proper worship, ordered towards love, freedom. And here is a sign, again, as to how Moses is so unique and important. Then Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. And thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, 'The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will hearken to your voice. And you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. And now we pray you, let us go 3 days' journey in the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go, unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all the wonders which I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor and of her who sojourns in her house jewelry of silver and gold and clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters. Thus you shall despoil the Egyptians." So there's a number of problems that Moses immediately brings up that God over responds to. Moses points out that, and from his experience earlier, that he can't just simply go to Israel and say, "Follow me, He tried that. It didn't work. He wanted to be able to unite the people of Israel in their common suffering and in their common trial, and it was not good enough. And not only that, the very tension between the Egyptians and the Hebrew people is analogous to the very struggles between Cain and Abel. It goes all the way back to the foundation of creation, where brother fights against brother. And for such a profound problem that goes to the very root of creation itself, God then, for the first time, gives his name. I am. Blessed John Duns Scotus, a medieval saint and thinker, had a profound reflection in the beginning of one of his great philosophical works about this very name of God, eternally present, neither past nor future, but all now, all truth, all real, and the source of everything that we call being. But it goes deeper than a reflection merely on being. God is more than just being and power. God is so much God that he reveals his glory by setting the captives free. But God himself realizes the problem, where God says, Egypt won't let you go. Egypt won't let you go. And that is a function of Egypt's enslavement. Something that we will see in the next video is that when Moses begins his powerful mission, Egypt will quickly say, okay, fine, but no. It's complicated. And this hardness of heart that the book of Exodus describes on the part of Pharaoh is peculiarly placed at God's feet. God says, I will harden his heart. And that seems to make no sense. Why would God give Moses the power to free the people of Israel from Egypt while making Egypt more stubborn and then making the suffering of the Hebrew people worse? Why this cycle? And it has something to do with the very nature of God's creating power itself. God created the universe and all the rivers and all the plants of the earth and all the animals and of the family itself. And it's out of consideration for those things that Pharaoh is reluctant to let the people free. Because, as he said in the very beginning of the book, if I give them what they want, if I give them peace, if I give them stability, my kingdom will be in danger. And this is where all good people and civilizations are always in danger of becoming tyrants. When we want to keep God's blessings that God has given. And so, in a sense, God is responsible for Pharaoh's hardness of heart. And the scriptures are wise enough to admit that fact. By the very act of creating the world, and a world where suffering is possible, God is, in a sense, responsible. Just as when God chose Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he bound his name to them. And so that promise that he made, he would need to bring to its fulfillment. And so the great I am that spoke to Abraham, that spoke to Isaac, that spoke to Jacob, is now speaking through Moses. Because for God, all of those actions are present now. And Israel's liberation from captivity is the pattern for our freedom in Christ.